Anyone familiar with What Culture Comics will know that we love cartoons, and that kind of makes sense if you think about it. For those of us who grew up in the 90s and early noughties, cartoons were our gateway into comics, whether that was through Batman animated series over on DC's end, or, you guessed it, the X-Men over on Marvel's. The DCAU may still be the cream of the crop in terms of super shows, go check out our video on that Wii universe for more on that please, but Marvel have also had some seriously stunning series in their time. Spider-Man, X-Men Evolution, and Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes are all genuinely great, but there is one that's more iconic, the X-Men animated series from the 1990s. Although there have been about a dozen cartoons based on the team since, the 1992 version is often considered to be the best animated incarnation of the team, well, ever. Naturally, there are a whole host of fascinating facts about the 90s X-Men show. So, I'm Ewan, this is What Culture Comics, and here are 10 mind-blowing facts you didn't know about the 90s X-Men cartoon. Number 10. The whole show was scrapped and reworked after one episode. Nowadays, it's common knowledge that X-Men had a failed pilot called Pride of the X-Men with an Australian Wolverine. Foreshadowing much. However, few people know the process of how that episode came to be. Margaret Lesh, who was the executive producer of the show, as well as Spider-Man, was looking for a new cartoon to produce. Reading Marvel Comics and research, she believed that the X-Men had more potential due to dealing with complex themes like racism, discrimination, and prejudice. For 8 long years, studios rejected her proposal, saying that the team was just too obscure. When the show was finally greenlit, the studio still wasn't sure it would become a hit, and so decided to overstuff the pilot episode with as many characters as possible, hoping it would sell toys. The episode itself wasn't bad, it was just okay. Now, okay is fine for most cartoons. Kids aren't expecting Citizen Kane or anything, they just need to watch something entertaining for about 20 minutes. But Margaret Lesh didn't want the show to be just okay. She wanted it to be great, and so reworked and recast everything. She was also told that if the first season didn't bring in the ratings, that she'd be fired. Hoo boy. Number 9. It was utter chaos from the first episode. The studio decided to release the first 2 episodes of X-Men simultaneously so the viewers would be able to understand the story and characters better. When these episodes premiered, it was a disaster. The animator's schedule was so tight, they literally made hundreds of mistakes where sound and animation wasn't synced up. The creators were given 2 chances to make a great show, and it seemed like they'd blown their chance. But they weren't going to go down without a fight. The animators crunched for hours and fixed all the mistakes in the pilot before airing it again. Sadly, that wasn't the only problem. Because this took place before the era of the internet, miscommunication was a huge problem with many studios. Sometimes episodes were shown in the wrong order, which was highly confusing if a story was made up of 3 or 4 episodes. There were also times where an episode was finished but it wouldn't air for a whopping 2 years. With egos clashing, changes in crew or producers, executives leaving, and scripts being rewritten in a day, it's a miracle the show even saw the light of day in the first place. Number 8. The video game that nearly destroyed the show. Despite the fact that Pride of the X-Men flopped, the studio was certain it would be a hit. And the show didn't just have one superhero. There were tons of characters, and you know what that means?
Toys!
Toys! Toys!
Toys!
And of course, every successful television show needs to have a video game. And it just so happens that the X-Men's one became pretty iconic. When Konami learned that Pride of the X-Men wasn't being picked up and the writers were going back to the drawing board, they realized they were in trouble. One of the main characters in the game was Dazzler. However, she wasn't going to be in this new version of the X-Men cartoon, so gamers who played the X-Men game didn't have a clue who she was. The game also suffered some seriously notorious mistranslations. Magneto refers to himself as the
Master of Magnet!
and tells you to welcome to die, which is the same greeting Jules greets you with every morning, come to think of it. Dear God. Although Konami thought they would lose millions, the game turned out really well. In fact, some people heard of the X-Men for the first time from that game, not the show. They loved the title so much, it encouraged them to check out the cartoon, which boosted the ratings and then some. Number 7. An episode that was so good, it was incorporated into the comics. Season 4 kicked off with the story One Man's Worth. In this tale, a time traveler goes back in time and kills Charles Xavier before he forms the X-Men. Since the X-Men never existed, the world is plunged into an apocalyptic dystopia. Wolverine and Storm ally with Bishop to try and reverse Xavier's death. Most X-Men fans assume this story is based on the comic Age of Apocalypse. However, it was the show that created the story, not the comics. In the comic, Xavier's mentally unstable son Legion goes back in time to kill Magneto to ensure peace between humans and mutants. Not understanding his son's intentions, Xavier jumps in front of Magneto as Legion unleashes a lethal blast, killing him in one blow. With Xavier dead, the X-Men never form, which allows Apocalypse to take over the entire world. The X-Men still visit this timeline over 20 years after it was written. It's an incredible feat that the show's writers wrote a story that was so good, it still affects the comics over 2 decades later. Number 6. The show's writers were actually married. Although Eric Lewald has written over Transformers, Young Hercules, Inspector Gadget, Darkwing Duck, and dozens of other shows, he said that people seem to gravitate mostly towards his work on X-Men. He got to work on the show with his wife Julia. In fact, Julia was the main writer for the episode Days of Future Past, which is based on the X-Men comic of the same name. Because the writers were a married couple, they looked at these characters as people, not superheroes. In Julia's own words, you had the chance to tell some fairly profound stories and still have bright shiny things blow up. When they approached studios to take on the show, the pair were constantly told to dumb things down and to not challenge the audience. When the show was picked up by Fox, Eric explained his frustrations with other executives and said he wanted the story to focus on relationships and love triangles. The studio head said, "Do that, push it, write it as adult and sophisticated as you can." Thankfully, Eric and Julia didn't compromise their vision and wound up creating one of the most beloved children's shows of the decade. Number 5. The writer didn't know anything about the X-Men. Eric Lewald was about to work on a new project when he got a phone call saying that as of tomorrow, he was in charge of writing X-Men. The first thing Lewald said was, "That's a Marvel book, right?" At the time, he couldn't name one of the characters to save his life. As a reference, he used an encyclopedia called Marvel Universe, the 1989 edition to be exact. But Lewald knew that wasn't enough. He didn't need a book, he needed a nerd. Or in this case, 2 nerds. The producer of the show, Larry Houston, and the supervising producer, Wilman Yo, were avid X-Men fans and were responsible for every Easter egg and cameo in the show. However, since Houston and Moon Yo were so obsessed with the comic, they wanted to shove in 40 characters into every episode. Who can blame them for trying? Number 4. Most of the cameos were put in against the studio's wishes. Okay, X-Men's a comic book. If you're adapting the story for a cartoon, you need to have a little fan service. A cameo here and there. Maybe a reference to other superheroes like Iron Man and Captain America. However, it's not that simple. If you want a certain character to appear, you have to double check with the studio head. Unless the character is going to be used for a main story, the studio is usually going to reject a character because they don't want to pay a licensing fee for a throwaway cameo. The producers understood the studio's wishes and completely ignored them. The show's creators shoved in as many cameos as possible without the studio's knowledge. When a scene cut to New York, Spider-Man can clearly be seen shooting a web. But in the script, Spider-Man was marked down with a generic name like Web Mutant. Web Mutant. Great. The producers, writers, and animators did this all the time right under the noses of the executives. Doctor Strange was labeled in the script as a magician. Thunderbird was mutant number 4. The super adaptoid was a robot. When Deadpool appeared for a few seconds, the executives assumed he was just a random character, oblivious that he was taken directly from the comics. Hey! Number 3. Beast was barely going to appear in the show. Despite being an integral part of the cartoon, Beast was only meant to cameo every once in a while. Luckily, the writer, Julia Lewald, argued that he encapsulated what the show was about more than anything else. In this story, humans hate mutants for looking different and having abilities that were potentially dangerous. Beast looks like a monster, but he is the most peaceful member of the team. In Lewald's own words, he's that damaged, gentle poet that all us girls fall for. Another writer said that he adored writing Beast's dialogue because, quote, his quotes were our personal indulgence. Instead of a call for action, he would say something poetic. Although he was meant to only make an occasional appearance, he showed up in 71 of 76 episodes. The only character that appeared more often was Wolverine. Number 2. The animators had to be sneaky to save time and money. Making a single episode of a cartoon in the 1990s took about 10 months. To ensure an entire season would be ready for its deadline, animators had to work on most of the episodes simultaneously. Even when the crew members are working around the clock, sometimes it's impossible to reach a deadline, unless you cut corners. The animators said that one of the hardest things to draw was the X-Men, which was composed of about 10 characters to all run in the same direction. Drawing them moving from one location to another was a nightmare. To save time, the lead writer would insert a line of dialogue of Cyclops saying something like, "X-Men to the Blackbird." The scene would then transition to the team arriving at their destination with Cyclops saying, "We're here." The writer said this was only done so the animators didn't have to slog for weeks drawing the running animations for each character. Number 1. What if the show wasn't cancelled? X-Men was supposed to end with an ultimate battle over time and space against Apocalypse. The saga would conclude with 4 of the main characters dying: Storm, Jean Grey, Professor X, and Cyclops, and 4 new members joining the X-Men: Psylocke, Archangel, Bishop, and Shard. The show would then be relaunched, probably as Uncanny X-Men or X-Factor. When the ratings went through the roof, the studio ordered another season. Because Marvel was on the verge of bankruptcy at the time, the money dried up halfway through season 5, which is why the last few episodes were of a poorer animation quality. Although the show did end abruptly, the X-Men had a very touching conclusion. After Xavier was gravely wounded, Lilandra takes him to the other side of the galaxy to revive him. The show ended with the X-Men knowing they would never see their mentor ever again. If there was another season, it would have begun with the team disbanding after the Professor's departure. One day, they receive a distress signal from Xavier, forcing them to head into space to rescue their leader. After retrieving him, they find a way to restore his health so he could return to Earth. Although this story never came to be, it's still a moving and inspirational idea. And hey, just saying, but I would read the F out of a comic that picked up that unaired storyline. Just saying. Marvel? Just saying.